The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the traitor brought news from the capital. Maren Vael read the letter first. It was brief in the specific way that dismissals are brief when the person writing them has not considered the person receiving them. 4 sentences, a formal seal, and a signature she did not recognize because the person who signed it was not senior enough to have been the one who decided. The language said, application reviewed, designation requirements unmet. Court position not suitable for the applicant's profile. It did not say, we read your letter aloud to a room full of people, and the king laughed. The traitor told her that part. She stood in her cottage doorway with the letter in her right hand, and the traitor's account settling into her like cold water, finding the lowest point in a room, and she was very still for a long moment. Not the stillness of someone suppressing something. The stillness of someone deciding something, precisely and without drama. The way you decide a thing when you have already done all the feeling about it, that is useful, and what remains is simply the question of what you do next. She crossed to the shelf beside her desk. She took down the locked correspondence box, heavy, the weight of 4 years inside it, and she held it for a moment. She looked at it. Then she put it back on the shelf in its exact position, and went to make herself tea. The decoded master cipher remained inside the box. Unsubmitted. Waiting. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Edron was the kind of village that understood its own people with the practical thoroughness of a community that had been watching the same families for generations and had developed, through that long observation, a reliable collective instinct for what a person was and what they were capable of. What Edron understood about Maren Vael was this: she was precise, she was reliable. She was privately unusual in a way that the village had collectively decided not to examine too closely, because the examining would not change anything useful, and she was not causing any problems. And in a village that had seen enough difficulty to have developed a sophisticated appreciation for the absence of problems, not causing any was its own form of belonging. She had arrived in Edron at 17, brought by her mother's distant cousin to help with the household after her mother's death. And she had stayed after the cousin moved on because Edron had offered her a room and work and the specific quality of anonymity that comes from being in a place small enough to know you and large enough to leave you alone about it. She had been here 4 years. The village had absorbed her the way it absorbed most things, practically, without ceremony, and with the durable acceptance of a community that valued consistency over explanation. Her days had a shape that the village recognized. She woke early and walked the market path before the stalls were fully set up, which gave her time to handle the merchandise before the morning rush made that kind of unhurried contact impossible. This was practical. She had always told herself and others she liked to assess quality before purchase, to feel the fabric of a cloth or the weight of a tool before committing to it. This was true as far as it went. It did not go all the way. At the market she was known for 2 things: never being overcharged, because she somehow always knew the fair price for everything before she was told it, and being able to identify sealed or locked containers by their contents without opening them, which she explained as a sensitivity to weight and material density that she had developed through years of handling goods. The market vendors had tested this enough times to trust it and had stopped questioning it, which was all she needed. In the afternoons she worked at the correspondence office. This was not an official position. Aldous, the village correspondence clerk, a man of 60 with half-moon spectacles and the careful handwriting of someone who had always treated letters as serious objects, had begun asking her help 5 months after her arrival. When a resident had received a complex legal document in formal court language that Aldous's practical vocabulary could not fully navigate, Maren had sat down with the document and had read it in the comprehensive, systematic way she read everything, not just its surface language, but its encoded implications, the things it was saying under and between its official phrasing, and had provided the resident with a complete and accurate account of its meaning and obligations within the hour. Aldous had looked at her over his spectacles afterward and said, simply, "Can you come back on Thursday?" She had been coming back on Thursdays ever since, and the Thursday sessions had expanded to include Mondays and occasionally Wednesdays when the correspondence volume warranted it. And she had become in practice, if not in title, the correspondence office's second reader, the person Aldous brought the difficult material to, the the documents and languages he did not read. The formal court correspondence with its layered procedural grammar. The occasional sealed pouch that a resident received from a distant relative and could not immediately account for. She did not tell Aldous everything about how she read these materials. She told him enough, that she had a facility for encoded language, that her hands helped her process complex documents, that she had always been this way. Aldous was a man who had spent 60 years developing a practical understanding of what questions were useful and which ones were simply curious. And he had decided early on that the question of how Maren did what she did was the latter kind. He asked what he needed to ask and left the rest alone. She valued this about him more than she had ever told him. In the evenings she returned to the cottage. She kept the small desk in the back room in the careful order of someone for whom organization was not aesthetic preference but functional necessity. The private record book on the left, the current working materials in the center. The stack of decoded communiques on the right in chronological order. And the locked correspondence box on the shelf behind all of it, sitting with the patient solidity of an object that understood it was waiting and had made its peace with that. She had built a life here that was honest and functional, and that required no one to understand her more than they needed to in order for it to work. This was, she had come to understand, a kind of achievement. It was not the life she had applied for, but it was hers, entirely and without apology. And she had learned to live in it fully rather than treating it as the anteroom to something better. The locked box on the shelf behind her desk was the only place where the life she had built and the life she had applied for existed in the same object. She did not look at it more than once a day. She had made this a rule, and she kept it. The trader's name was Ben, and he came through Edron on the first and third Tuesday of every month without significant variation, which was one of the things Maren appreciated about him. Consistency in a person was its own form of honesty. He arrived at her cottage door on the Tuesday of the rejection letter with a locked correspondence, pouch under one arm, and the expression of a man who had already tried the obvious solutions and was now at the step where he knocked on Maren Vael's door. He had done this 4 times before. He understood the procedure. He said, "I cannot find the key, and the recipient is in Westholme, and the delivery window closes at sundown." She said, "Come in." He set the pouch on her desk, and she sat down and placed both palms flat against the oiled leather of it and held them there. The lock was a standard 4-position tumbler. She felt its configuration against her left palm within the first few seconds. The specific sequence of its set positions resolving with the same immediacy that a written word resolves for a literate person. Symbol becoming meaning before the conscious mind has time to decide to interpret it. The letters inside the pouch were 3 in number. 2 were personal correspondence of no complexity. The third was a formal property transfer document requiring the recipient's signature and seal before the close of the month. She lifted her hands from the pouch and told Ben what it contained and what the deadline was, and he wrote it down and thanked her and left. And the entire transaction had taken 11 minutes and had required her to open nothing. She sat for a moment after he left with her palms resting on the desktop. This was the part she allowed herself in private, the brief sitting with it, the acknowledgement of what had just happened in a space where no one was watching, and she did not have to explain it as sensitivity to weight and material density. Her gift was not sensitivity to weight and material density. Her gift was the complete and immediate decryption of any encoded information through skin contact. And she had known this with precision since she was 17 years old, and it had been 4 years, and she was still, in most contexts, performing the lesser description. She reached for the communique. It had come through Ben on his previous visit, tucked into the bottom of a mixed goods pouch with the specific carelessness of something that had been moved quickly and without full attention to what was being moved with it. It was a field order, sealed in the enemy's standard field cipher, the variant used for tactical communications between forward units. Distinguishable from the strategic cipher by the density of its encoding and the particular pattern of its symbol distribution. She had decoded 7 of this variant in the past year and a half. This was the 8th. She picked it up and felt the encoded text resolve against her palms with the immediate completeness she had come to think of as reading, because that was what it was. The symbols did not first appear as symbols and then become meaning. They arrived as meaning. The encoding transparent to her touch the way glass is transparent to light. The field order said, Advance the eastern supply line closure to the 14th. Coordinate with the 2nd Inland Unit for simultaneous border pressure at the Edron Crossing and the Havath Junction. Confirm receipt through the standard channel by the 10th. She set the order down and opened her private record book and wrote the date, the Cipher variant, and the decoded content in the careful, systematic way she recorded everything. She noted the Edron Crossing reference with the specific internal stillness of someone receiving information that has direct personal relevance and choosing to process it accurately before feeling anything about it. Then she looked at her stack of decoded communiques. She counted them, which she did sometimes when the counting was not strictly necessary, because the counting was itself a form of accounting, a way of making concrete and undeniable the accumulation of something that she was not permitted to pretend was small. 47. 47 decoded enemy communiques, produced over 4 years, covering field orders and strategic dispatches and cipher variants from 3 different enemy units and 2 different encryption periods. 47 pieces of intelligence that the kingdom's core did not have, organized by date and subject in the careful order of someone who had always understood, at some level, that they were building a record that would eventually matter to someone. She looked at the stack. She looked at the locked correspondence box on the shelf above it, which held the decoded master cipher, the strategic cipher, the one that had been defeating the royal intelligence apparatus since before she arrived in Edron. The one she had decoded in a single afternoon 14 months ago, when a traitor had passed through with a sealed document he was carrying without understanding what it was. She thought about the 64 people who had died on the border last week. She thought about the locked box. She made herself not think about both of those things at the same time, because thinking about both of them at the same time had a cost she was not willing to pay today, on the same day the rejection letter had arrived. She closed the record book. She straightened the stack. She looked at the box on the shelf and then looked away from it, deliberately, in the way she had practiced. Once a day. That was the rule. She had already looked once. Aldous had told her on a Wednesday. She remembered the day with the specific, involuntary completeness of memories that arrive fully formed and stay that way. The gray morning light through his office window. The smell of ink and old paper that was as much a part of that room as its walls. The way he had set down his pen when she came in and folded his hands on the desk in the particular way he did when he had something to say that he had been thinking about how to say. He said, "I have received a letter from my contact in the capital." He said it with the careful tone of a man who had already decided that honesty was the only appropriate form this conversation could take and was committing to it fully. He said, "It concerns your application." She had sat down in the chair across from his desk. She had folded her own hands in her lap and looked at him and said, "Tell me." He told her. His contact was a junior administrative clerk in the capital's government district, a reliable correspondent who had been passing all this local information for 15 years in the informal way. That people who care about their home communities maintain connections to the larger world. The clerk had been present at the assembly. Not as a participant, as part of the administrative staff managing the session's correspondence. Present in the room, but not at the table, visible to no one who was looking at the table. He had written to Aldous because he had recognized the application. Aldous had shown him, in an earlier letter, the document Maren had prepared, had been proud of it, had wanted someone who moved in official circles to see what his correspondence office's second reader had produced. The clerk recognized it when the Intelligence Corps director read the header aloud. The account was precise, and the precision of it was what made it impossible to manage at a distance. The director reading the header. The first response from the court, a ripple of amusement, uncertain at first. Building as the language of the application revealed itself to be serious and specific, and therefore, in the Assembly's collective judgment, funnier than a clearly absurd application would have been. The king's laughter arriving at a particular moment, the clerk had written down which sentence it was, with the careful accuracy of someone documenting something they understood would matter. The sentence was the one in which Maren had described her gift's operational capacity in formal intelligence language. Precisely because she had understood that precision was the correct register for a professional application, and had not known, could not have known, that precision in an uncredentialed Omega applicant would be received as the punchline rather than the substance. Aldous read her the relevant passage from the clerk's letter in a voice that was steady and matter of fact, and that she understood was costing him something to keep that way. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she sat for a moment in the gray morning light, and then asked one question. She said, "Did he read it himself before they read it aloud?" Aldous said he did not know. He said his contact's account suggested the director had received the application as part of a general review bundle, and had selected it for the assembly reading without prior consultation with the king. Which meant the king's first encounter with the document may have been the public reading. He said he was not certain. She said, "I think he did not. I think he heard the header and laughed at the concept of it before he knew what it contained." She said it without particular bitterness, as an assessment, the way she assessed everything, for accuracy rather than comfort. And then she said, "That is almost worse. Deliberate cruelty requires engagement. What he did required nothing at all." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry." He said it simply and completely, the way he did everything, without cushioning it into something smaller than it was. She said, "I know." She meant it. She had gone home, and she had looked at the locked box for a long time that evening, longer than the rule allowed. But she had decided the rule could sustain one exception given the day's circumstances. She had thought about the 2 years of preparation the application represented. The careful documentation of her gift's capabilities, the sample decryption she had included, the formal language she had chosen with such deliberate precision. She had thought about the assembly. She had thought about the sentence the king had laughed at. And then she had put the box back on the shelf and closed the record book and gone to bed. Because the alternative was a grief that would not be productive, and she had always been, above all else, a person who distinguished between the feelings that were useful and the ones that simply hurt. She had been back in Aldous's office the following morning at the usual hour, at the usual desk, working through the usual correspondence. He had looked at her over his spectacles and had not asked how she was, which was exactly correct. But before she left that evening, he said, as she was putting on her coat, "There is one more thing from the letter." He said, "My contact noted that Director Vorn, the Intelligence Corps chief, did not laugh." He said she watched the reading with an expression he described as something other than amusement. Maren paused with her coat half on. Aldous said, "And she took the application with her when the assembly ended." Not the copy, the original. Director Hesse Vorn knocked on Maren's cottage door on a Thursday morning in late autumn. 4 months after the assembly and 2 weeks after 64 people died on the border. She came alone. No escort, no formal insignia. No carriage with the Intelligence Corps seal on the door, a hired travel horse and working clothes, and the specific lack of ceremony of someone who had thought carefully about how to arrive and had decided that arriving without ceremony was the only version of this visit that was honest. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their careers in rooms where what you do not say matters as much as what you do. Maren had seen her coming from the desk window. She had watched her dismount and tie the horse and walk the path to the cottage door with the measured pace of someone who had rehearsed this approach and was executing it with deliberate care. She had watched all of this, and then she had sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and taken stock of what she felt about it. What she felt was unsurprised, which itself was information. She had been expecting someone. She had not known when or with what face. But she had been expecting the knock ever since the border news reached Edrin. And the part of her that had always been accurate about these things had known it would be someone significant. She opened the door before the second knock. She said, "I wondered when someone would come." Director Vorn looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman conducting a rapid professional evaluation and finding the results consistent with what she had expected. She said, "May I come in?" Maren stepped aside. She did not offer tea immediately, which was a departure from her usual courtesy, and which she did not apologize for. Because the departure was deliberate, she was not going to make this easier than it needed to be until she understood what it was. She gestured to the chair across from her desk and sat down in her own chair and looked at Director Vorn with the composed, level attention she brought to everything she took seriously. Vorn sat. She did not look around the cottage or comment on it. She placed a document case on the desk between them and did not open it. She said, "I will be direct with you." Maren said, "Please." Vorn said, 2 weeks ago the enemy's master Cipher produced its first operational result. 3 simultaneous strikes on border territories using encrypted orders that my analysts could not decode in time. She paused. 64 people died. She said it plainly, which was the correct way to say it. Not softened, not performed, simply named. Maren said, I know. News reached Edrin within 4 days. Vorn said, I have been reviewing every lead my corps has pursued on the master Cipher for the past 3 years. She opened the document case and placed a single sheet on the desk, a page Maren recognized immediately, because she had written it. The sample decryption from her application. She said, this was in the rejected application file. I retrieved it from the assembly room after the session ended. I have had my senior analysts review it for the past 4 months. It is accurate. It decodes a section of the master cipher that my best people have been unable to break. Maren looked at the sheet. She said, I know it is accurate. Vorn said, I need to understand what you can do. Not what the sample shows, the full scope. She looked at Maren steadily. And I need to understand what it would take for you to help us. The word help landed in the room with the specific weight of a word that was doing more work than its syllables suggested. Maren held it for a moment, feeling its full load. She thought about the 64 dead. She thought about the locked box on the shelf behind her. She thought about the sentence the king had laughed at. She said, the full scope is this. She told it plainly and completely. Every cipher, every encoding system, every variant she had encountered in 4 years. She described the immediacy of it, the lack of effort required, the complete absence of any system she had found that resisted her. She watched Vorn's face as she spoke and noted the quality of the listening, precise, non-reactive. The listening of a professional receiving information and cataloging it accurately without allowing her response to the magnitude of it to interrupt the reception. When Maren finished, Vorn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what do you need? Not what does the Corps need from you? What do you need in order to consider helping? The question was the right question, and both of them knew it. Maren looked at the locked box on the shelf. She said, I need to think about it. She said it without apology, because no apology was owed for taking time to decide whether to help people who had publicly laughed at her. She said, I will give you my answer by tomorrow morning. Vorn nodded and stood. She said, I will be at the Edrin rest house until then. She was at the door when Maren asked the question she had been holding since the moment Vorn dismounted in the path. She said, when the king laughed, did he know my name? Vorn stopped with her hand on the door frame. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no. He did not read the application before the assembly. He laughed at the concept of it. She paused. He knows your name now. I made certain of that. She left. The cottage held the silence she left behind. Maren sat at her desk for a long time, looking at the shelf, thinking about the difference between a man who laughs at a person and a man who laughs at an idea before he has bothered to find out whether a person is inside it. She was not certain, she decided, that the distinction was as significant as it was supposed to be. But it was something. It was the beginning of a something, and she was, above all else, a person who worked with what she had. She did not sleep that night, which was not unusual when she had a significant decision to work through. Sleep required the mind to release its grip on a problem, and her mind did not release its grip on significant problems until it had finished with them, which was occasionally inconvenient and always accurate. She sat at her desk in the dark cottage with the locked box on the table in front of her. She had taken it down from the shelf, which was itself a decision, a preliminary movement toward the larger one, and she worked through the question the way she worked through everything. Not by listing considerations and weighing them against each other in the abstract, but by following the thing to its actual center, the place where the real question lived under the procedural ones. The procedural questions were straightforward. She could help. Her gift was exactly what the situation required, and she had 4 years of accumulated intelligence to offer on top of whatever current work the Corps needed. Director Vorn was serious, and had not laughed, and had retrieved the application from the assembly room floor, which was as close to an institutional acknowledgement as she was going to receive before the larger acknowledgement that she intended to require. The 64 dead were real, and the next 64 were preventable, and she knew things that could prevent them. These were the procedural questions, and they were settled. The real question was, What did it mean to give her gift to an institution that had publicly designated it a joke? And what did she need from that institution before she could do that without it costing her something she could not recover from? She went to Aldous in the morning. He was already at his desk when she arrived, which was always true, and he looked at her over his spectacles with the expression that meant he had been expecting her and had prepared himself to be useful rather than simply present. She sat down and told him about Director Vorn's visit, fully and without abbreviation, because he had earned the full version of everything that touched his advocacy for her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is it that you are actually deciding? Not whether to help. I think you have already decided that." He looked at her with the patient accuracy of 60 years of reading people carefully. He said, "You are deciding what you need in order to help without losing something essential in the helping." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then what is the essential thing?" She thought about the assembly. She thought about the sentence the king had laughed at. She thought about 2 years of preparation and a formal application submitted through correct channels, treated as entertainment. She said, "I need to not be invisible in this. I need the institution to receive me as a professional whose gift is being formally engaged, not as an asset being quietly activated through a side entrance because the front door laughed at her." Aldous said, "That seems correct and reasonable." She said, "And I need the king to acknowledge what was done, not in a letter. In person, in a professional context, where it is on the record." Aldous said, "Also correct." He picked up his pen. He said, "Write the letter. I will verify the language." She wrote the conditions at Aldous's desk on a sheet of his correspondence paper, in the careful, formal language she used for official documents. She would come to the capital. She would work on the master cipher under Director Vorn's oversight exclusively. She would submit the 47 decoded communiques for official intelligence processing, and she required a formal professional reception from the king, including a direct acknowledgement of the assembly incident before any work was presented to the crown. She sealed the letter with the correspondence office seal and held it for a moment before handing it to Aldous to dispatch. She felt her own encoding against her palms. This was new. She had never tried to read her own sealed correspondence before, had never thought to. And the discovery that her gift worked on her own encoding stopped her for a moment with a quality of surprise that she did not often experience. She felt the words she had written, decoded, coming back to her through the wax seal as clear and complete as when she had set them down. She read herself. The conditions were exactly as she had intended them. Precise, reasonable, non-negotiable in the specific way that things are non-negotiable when they represent the minimum required for a person to maintain their own integrity while doing something difficult. She handed the letter to Aldous. He dispatched it to the Edrin rest house within the hour. Director Vorn's response arrived by the afternoon. It was brief and direct and said, "Your conditions are accepted in full. Transport leaves Edrin at dawn tomorrow." Maren read the response through the envelope before she opened it, because she could, and because she wanted to know before the official knowing, in the private space of her own palms, that it said what she hoped. It said what she hoped. She opened it anyway, officially, because some things deserved to be received in the proper form, even when you already knew the content. She went home and packed one bag. The locked correspondence box went in last, wrapped in the extra linen she had packed against the winter cold. Settled in the center of the bag where it would not shift in transit. She had carried it carefully for 4 years. She intended to carry it carefully a little further, to the place where it could finally be opened in front of the people who needed to see what was inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet cottage and looked at the shelf where the box had lived for 4 years. The shelf was empty now, and the emptiness of it was the specific emptiness of a space that has been waiting for something to be removed from it. She was ready. The intelligence core building was not what she had imagined, which was information about what she had imagined. She had imagined something that looked like the serious work being done inside it, compact, purposeful, with the functional aesthetic of a place that had no time for anything that did not contribute to the work. What she found was a building that had been designed to communicate authority, which was a different project entirely. High ceilings, wide corridors, the visual grammar of an institution that understood itself as significant and wanted visitors to understand this immediately. She arrived in the early morning in Director Vorn's travel carriage. with her single bag and the locked correspondence box held on her lap for the journey, because the alternative was putting it in the luggage rack, and she was not ready to do that yet. Vorn had met her in Edron at dawn, and they had traveled largely in silence, which suited them both. Vorn was not a conversational traveler, and Maren was occupied with the specific internal management of a person arriving somewhere they had been trying to reach for a long time through a door considerably different from the one they had applied to. The core staff received her with the particular mixture of curiosity and condescension that she had expected and had prepared herself for. Not hostility, something more ambient than hostility. The institutional culture of a professional body encountering someone who had arrived through an irregular channel and whose standing had not yet been established in the categories the institution recognized. They were polite in the specific way of people who are reserving their full courtesy for the moment, when they understand exactly who they are dealing with. She was polite in return, precisely and without excess, and she noted everything. Vorn processed her in with the brisk efficiency of someone managing a sensitive situation, and understanding that speed was itself a form of protection. The faster Maren was inside the building and at work, the less time the institutional culture had to organize its condescension into something structural. She was given a working room, led there by a junior officer who did not ask about the locked box, and left with the assurance that Director Vorn would return within the hour. The working room had no window. Maren set her bag down and set the locked correspondence box on the desk, and stood in the center of the room for a moment, feeling its dimensions. Small, functional. The kind of room that communicated, without intending to, exactly what the institution thought of the person being put in it. She noted this also. She filed it in the part of her mind reserved for accurate information that she would address at the appropriate time and did not need to address right now. She opened the locked correspondence box.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Maren Vael brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
She took out the decoded master cipher and laid it on the desk. She took out the 47 decoded communiques in their organized sequence and laid them beside it. She took out her private record book and opened it to the most recent entry. She arranged all of it in the precise, systematic order of a professional preparing a workspace. And by the time Director Vorn knocked and opened the door 10 minutes later, the room had been transformed from a space that communicated the institution's low estimate of its occupant to a space that communicated the occupant's complete indifference to that estimate. Vorn looked at the desk and then at Maren and said simply good. She was beginning a preliminary briefing on the current state of the Cipher investigation when the door opened again. Maren had her back to the door. She heard the footsteps, 2 sets, the second heavier and more deliberate than the first. The footsteps of someone who moved through spaces with the unconscious authority of a person accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around their arrival. She heard Vorn's slight adjustment of posture. The change in a person's physical arrangement when someone more senior than them has entered the space. She turned. King Dorian Vane was not what she had constructed from the account of the assembly. She had built him, in the 4 months since. From the single datum of his laughter, had assembled around that datum the figure of a man shaped by his worst moment, which was not accurate and which she had known was not accurate and had done anyway because accuracy about the people who hurt you was sometimes a discipline rather than an instinct. He was younger than she had imagined. He had the focused, precise quality of someone whose intelligence was genuine and habitual, visible in the way he took in the room in a single comprehensive look that moved from Vorn to the desk to her with the efficiency of a person who had trained themselves to see fully before responding. The mate bond arrived between them with the force of something that had been waiting specifically for this room. This morning, this exact arrangement of circumstances. It was not subtle. It was the most unsubtle thing Maren had experienced in 4 years of living carefully and precisely, and without dramatic incident. And it arrived in the middle of a situation that already had more complexity than she needed, and it did not ask her permission, and it did not care about her timeline. She managed it. She managed it with the focused internal discipline of someone who had been managing difficult things for a long time and had developed reliable methods, and she looked at him with the composed, Level gaze she had prepared for this encounter, and she said, "Your Majesty." She said it correctly. She said it with exactly the formal courtesy his position required, and exactly the warmth his actions had not earned. He said her name. He said Maren Vael. He said it the way a person says a name when they have been reading it and thinking about it, and are now encountering the person behind it for the first time. And the reality of the person is producing a recalibration of the concept they had been carrying. She watched the recalibration happen behind his eyes. She watched him look at the desk, the decoded master cipher, the 47 communiques in their organized sequence. The record book opened to its most recent page, and she watched him understand. In the span of 4 seconds, something of the full scope of what he was looking at. He said, "How long have you had this?" She said, "The master cipher decryption, 14 months. The communiques for years." The room was very quiet. The formal intelligence briefing was convened in the Corps' main analysis chamber within 2 hours of Maren's arrival, which was the fastest Director Vorn had ever convened a formal session in 15 years of running the Corps, and which communicated to everyone who received the summons exactly how significant the material was before they entered the room. The chamber held 12 people, the senior analysis team, 2 strategic advisors, and Dorian at the far end of the table, not at the head. He had taken the side position deliberately, Maren noted. The head of the table was where the person presenting stood, and he had positioned himself as a recipient rather than a chair, which was a small decision and an accurate one, and she noted it without assigning it more weight than it deserved. She stood at the head of the table with the decoded master cipher in front of her and the 47 communiques organized in 4 chronological groups to her left, and she presented. She had not prepared a formal presentation. She did not need one. The material was organized in her mind with the same comprehensive clarity. It was organized on the desk in her working room, for years of systematic accumulation. Every piece in its correct relationship to every other piece. The full picture assembled and available the way a map is available to someone who has been living in the territory it describes. She spoke from that clarity directly, without the mediating layer of prepared notes. And the directness of it had a quality that the room received in the specific way of professionals encountering someone who simply knows the material rather than having learned to present it. She began with the master cipher. She described its architecture, the layered encoding system, its structural logic. The reason it had resisted the Corps' analytical approaches for 3 years, which was that the Corps had been attempting to break it as a single unified system when it was in fact a nested system of 3 interdependent layers, each of which required the previous layer's resolution before it yielded. She had decoded all 3 layers simultaneously. Because her gift did not engage with encoding systems the way trained analysts did, it did not approach them from the outside and work inward. It simply read them, the way light reads a room, all at once and without sequence. The senior analysts listened with the focused intensity of people encountering the solution to a problem they had been living with for 3 years. She watched the room receive the information, and she watched the gradual, reluctant deference that competent professionals produce when they encounter someone who simply knows more than they do, not graceful, not immediate, but real, arriving in the specific quality of attention that replaces the earlier condescension when the earlier condescension has been made untenable by the evidence. Then she moved to the communiques. She presented them in groups, by unit, by cipher variant, by operational relevance to current border conditions. The room's quality of attention changed again as the scope of 4 years became clear. The timeline of the enemy's strategic planning visible in the accumulated record. The pattern of their operational decisions legible across the chronological sequence in a way that no single document revealed. She had been building, without institutional support or direction, a picture of the enemy's strategic posture that the Corps' entire analytical apparatus had not been able to construct from officially acquired intelligence. She did not say this. The room understood it. She was answering a question about cipher variant distribution when she became aware that Dorian had stopped engaging with the documents in front of him and was watching her, not with the analytical attention of a king receiving an intelligence briefing, with something quieter and more internal, the expression of a person watching something and simultaneously processing something that is not what they are watching. She continued answering the question. She did not look at him directly. But she was aware of his attention on her the way she was aware of everything, completely, and without the option to be otherwise. When the briefing concluded 2 hours after it began, the room held a particular silence. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people with more to say than they had yet organized into language. The strategic implications of the decoded material were significant and immediate and required the kind of rapid operational response that did not happen in the same meeting as the intelligence briefing. Director Vorn was already organizing the response structure when one of the senior analysts, a careful, methodical woman named Analyst Sov, who had been with the Corps for 11 years and who had received Maren's presentation with the most thorough and least reluctant attention in the room, said, quietly but in the complete silence clearly enough for everyone to hear, "This single session has produced more actionable intelligence than the Corps has generated in the past 18 months. She said it as a fact. It was a fact. The room received it as the thing it was, accurate, significant, and uncomfortable in the specific way of accurate things that implicate the people hearing them. Maren looked at the table in front of her and kept her face composed and let the fact stand without adding anything to it, because it did not need anything added. She looked up and found Dorian looking at her from the end of the table. His expression had moved past the processing stage and into something that was quieter and more settled, the expression of a person who has arrived at a conclusion they did not expect and are now living in it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she began gathering the communiques back into their organized sequence. Because the briefing was over and the work was beginning, and she had always been better at work than at the space between work and whatever came next. He asked to speak with her privately after the briefing room had cleared. Not through Vorn, not through the administrative channel that would have been the procedurally correct method. He waited until the last analyst had filed out, and then he looked at Maren across the empty table and said, "Will you stay for a few minutes?" It was phrased as a question and had the quality of a genuine question, which she noted. She said, "Yes." He closed the door. He did not return to the end of the table. He stood near the door for a moment with the expression of a man who had prepared something and had decided, on arrival at the moment of delivering it, that the prepared version was insufficient and he was going to have to find better words in real time. She watched this decision happen. She respected it more than she would have respected the prepared version. He said, "I want to address the assembly directly." She said, "I would prefer that too." He said, "I laughed." He said it without preamble and without the diplomatic framing that would have softened it into something more comfortable for the person delivering it. He said, "I should not have laughed. I laughed before I had read what you submitted, and I laughed because the assembly was laughing and because it was easy to laugh at, and I did not stop to ask whether the easy response was the correct one." He paused. "I read your application last night. All of it." She looked at him. She said, "What did you find in it?" He said, "A precise and comprehensive description of a gift I had no framework for. Submitted in the correct formal language by someone who understood that the correct formal language was necessary because the gift itself would not be granted the benefit of the doubt." He said, "A sample decryption that my senior analysts have spent 4 months confirming is accurate." He said, 2 years of preparation in a document that was treated as entertainment in under 10 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. He was making the correct acknowledgments in the correct order, and she was not going to interrupt that by responding before it was finished. He said, "I am sorry." He said it simply, the way he had said everything in this conversation, without cushioning, without the diplomatic framework that would have allowed him to be sorry in a way that cost him less. She received this. She held it in the same way she held all significant information, completely, without the instinct to immediately resolve it into something more manageable. She let it be what it was. Then she said, "I need you to understand the specific thing that the laughter cost me. Not the rejection." She looked at him steadily. "I expected rejection. That was a reasonable outcome for an uncredentialed Omega applicant to a professional corps with formal credential requirements. I had prepared for rejection." He was listening with his full attention. She had noted, across the morning, that he listened the way Aldous listened, without the concurrent formulation of response. Receiving first and processing after, which was rare enough in powerful people to be remarkable. She said, What I had not prepared for was the laughter. Because the laughter said something more specific than a rejection letter could say. A rejection letter says, "This application does not meet our current requirements." The laughter said, "This application is not worth reading before it is worth dismissing." She paused. And that distinction matters to me, because I had spent 2 years writing something worth reading. I had documented my gift with precision and care, and I had submitted it through the correct channels. In the correct form, and the laughter said that none of that effort was visible. That the concept of me submitting it was the content of the document, rather than what the document actually contained. He was very still. She said, "I am not telling you this, so that the telling can function as a transaction. So that the acknowledgement of the cost can be exchanged for a clean account." She said it clearly, because she had said something similar to Aldrich in the palace in a different story, and she understood how this kind of thing could be received as a bid for resolution, and she was not making a bid for resolution. She was making a record. He said, "I understand." She said, "I had been preparing that application for 2 years." She said it the way she had said it to him in the privacy of her own rehearsals, in the cottage in Edron. In the months after the assembly, when she had been deciding what this moment would look like. She said it, and it landed the way she had always known it would land. With the weight of a fact that is simple and specific, and that does not require elaboration to carry its full force. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression moved past the controlled acknowledgement he had been maintaining, and arrived at something more unguarded. The expression of a man feeling the full weight of something he had done without. Until this moment, having had to stand in the room with the person who had carried that weight. He said quietly, "I know. I read every word of it last night." She said, "I know you did. I can tell the difference between a person who has read something and a person who is managing a situation." She looked at him. "You have read it?" He said, "Yes." Then he told her what was in it that he had not expected. He went through it carefully and completely. The gift's operational parameters, the sample decryption's methodology, the formal intelligence framework she had used to organize her capabilities. He told her what he had understood, and what he had not yet fully understood, and where the gaps in his understanding were. With the specific honesty of a person doing the work of comprehension, rather than performing it. She listened to him describe her own application and felt, for the first time in 4 months, something that was not quite forgiveness and was not quite trust, but was the beginning of a ground on which both of those things might eventually be possible. 3 days into her capital residence, Maren had established a working rhythm. Morning, the active intelligence review, in which she decoded the current intercept queue, the encoded communiques that the Corps' field operatives collected through the trading networks and diplomatic channels, and which arrived daily in sealed pouches that her gift processed in a fraction of the time the analytical team required. Midday. The strategic synthesis session with Director Vorn and the 2 senior analysts who had been cleared for full access to Maren's decoded material. Afternoon. The deeper archival work. Cross-referencing the 4 years of accumulated decoded communiques against the Corps' official intelligence record to build the comprehensive picture of the enemy's strategic posture that the morning's current work was updating in real time. It was the most complete use of her gift she had ever made. The fullness of it had a quality she was still adjusting to, the specific feeling of a capacity that had been operating at partial output for years suddenly being given its full scope. The way a voice sounds different when it is finally allowed to use its full range. Dorian began attending the afternoon sessions on the 3rd day. He did not announce this as a policy or explain it as a strategic decision. He simply appeared at the analysis chamber door at the beginning of the afternoon session, and Director Vorn, after the briefest pause of a woman recalibrating her meeting structure, made room for him at the table without comment. He sat to Maren's left, not at the head, not at the strategic advisor's end, at the working position of someone who intended to participate rather than preside. He was, she discovered with the slight unwilling surprise of someone encountering evidence that contradicts a position they have been maintaining, genuinely good at this. The strategic synthesis of decoded intelligence into operational decisions was exactly the kind of thinking his role required, and he had developed it with the focused, systematic competence of a person who had been doing serious work for a long time and had not mistaken the trappings of authority for the thing itself. He asked precise questions. He identified connections between decoded material and existing strategic knowledge that the analysts had not yet articulated. He moved through the intelligence picture with a quickness and a comprehensiveness that she respected, despite the fact that respecting it complicated her position. She was aware of this complication, and she managed it with the honesty she brought to everything, by acknowledging it internally rather than pretending it was not there, and by not allowing it to interfere with the work. Because the work was more important than her management of the feelings the work was producing. On the third afternoon, toward the end of the session, she decoded a communiqué in his direct presence for the first time. It was a field dispatch that had arrived in the morning intercept queue and that she had set aside. Because its Cipher variant was a recently evolved form, she wanted to approach with her full afternoon attention rather than the morning's rapid processing mode. She picked it up from the stack, held it between her palms, and felt the encoding resolve with the same immediate completeness it always produced, the symbols transparent to her touch, the meaning arriving in the space between the paper and her skin. She was aware that he had stopped engaging with the documents in front of him. She set the communiqué down and reached for her transcription pen and wrote out the decoded content in the careful, systematic way she transcribed everything, and when she looked up he was watching her with the full, uncalculated attention of a person who has just seen something extraordinary and has made the decision not to manage their response to it into something more socially comfortable. She said, "The Cipher variant is a new evolution, third generation of the Eastern Field System." She slid the transcription toward Director Vorn. "The content is a supply route confirmation for the next 6 weeks." Vorn began reading the transcription. The analysts leaned in. Dorian said quietly, so that only she could hear it, "What does it feel like when you read one?" She looked at him. It was the same question he had asked in the briefing room. The question that had not yet been asked directly between them. She considered not answering. And then she decided that not answering was a form of management, and she was tired of managing everything. She said, "It feels like the encoding was never there. Like the document was always in plain language, and the cipher is simply a layer that my hands remove without effort." She paused. "It is not something I do. It is something that happens when I touch it. The distinction matters to me." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because something I do can be taught or replicated or performed on demand. Something that happens is what I am. And I have spent 4 years in a context where what I am was either invisible or a joke. And being precise about the nature of it is how I have kept it intact." He received this without comment and without the instinct to reframe it into something more comfortable, which was, she was learning, characteristic of him at his best. He simply held what she had said in the attentive silence that was becoming his most consistent quality in her presence. The session continued for another hour. At its end, as the analysts were gathering their materials, Dorian stayed at the table while the others filed out and looked at the decoded communiqué spread between them and then looked at her. He said, "This one references an internal source." He indicated a passage in the most recent transcription. 2 lines she had noted and set aside for Vorn's specific attention. A reference to a kingdom contact feeding cipher information to the enemy. She said, "I know. I flagged it for the director." He said, "The reference is specific enough to narrow the field considerably." She said, "Yes." She held his gaze. "Someone in the intelligence corps has been selling cipher information for at least 2 years." The room was very quiet. Director Vorn moved within hours of receiving the flagged reference. She convened a restricted briefing circle, herself, Dorian, and 2 senior analysts whose loyalty she had verified through independent means before Maren's arrival, and she laid out the internal review framework with the methodical precision of a woman who had been running sensitive operations for 15 years and understood that an investigation of this kind, conducted inside the institution it was investigating, required a speed and a discretion that could not be reconciled and therefore had to be traded off against each other with full awareness of the cost of each choice. She chose speed. The operational intelligence Maren had decoded was too current and too significant to allow the internal review to proceed at the deliberate pace of a standard investigation. Every day the informant remained unidentified was a day the enemy potentially received intelligence about the kingdom's response to Maren's decoded material, about which cipher variants had been compromised, which operational plans had been adjusted, which border vulnerabilities were now known and being addressed. The review began that evening. Vorn restricted access to Maren's working room and the decoded material to the briefing circle only, rerouted the daily intercept queue through a parallel channel that bypassed the standard analytical processing system, and implemented a communication monitoring protocol that covered every senior officer with access to the Cipher intelligence record for the past 2 years. Maren was told of the review in direct, complete terms by Vorn the following morning. She received the information with the focused attention she brought to significant operational details, asked 2 clarifying questions about the communication monitoring scope, and then said, "I want to tell you something I observed in the briefing room on the first day." She told Vorn about Cor Aldith. She described his reception of her briefing with the precise, non-editorial language of a professional delivering an accurate observation, the quality of his resistance, which had been more specific than the general condescension of the room, had carried a distinct quality of personal stake that she had noted and filed as potentially significant. She said, "I may be wrong. The resistance may be professional pride and nothing more. But the quality of it was different from the others, and I thought you should have the observation." Vorn wrote it down and said nothing that confirmed or denied whether the observation aligned with anything she had already developed. Her neutrality was itself information. The first 48 hours of the review produced no direct identification, but narrowed the field significantly. The communication monitoring flagged 3 anomalous correspondence patterns. 2 resolved under examination as legitimate. The third was still being analyzed when the working room incident occurred. Maren arrived at her working room on the morning of the review's second day and found it as she had left it the previous evening, except for one thing. The locked correspondence box was not in its exact position on the desk. It had been moved, returned with care, with the specific attention of someone who understood that precise people noticed displacement and had attempted to account for this, but not returned precisely enough. It was off by approximately half an inch in the horizontal plane and had been rotated 2 degrees from its original orientation. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. She did not touch anything. She went directly to Vorn's office and reported the displacement with the specific measurements and her assessment of what they implied. Someone had examined the box, found it locked, and returned it with the care of a person who knew that Maren would notice if they did not. Vorn tightened the security protocol immediately. She added a physical access log to the working room corridor and assigned a monitoring detail to the overnight shift. That afternoon, Cor Aldith submitted a formal request for a private meeting with Director Vorn on a personnel matter of urgent concern. The request arrived through the standard internal channel at the 3rd hour of the afternoon. At the 4th hour of the afternoon, a new intercepted communique arrived in the parallel intercept queue. Maren picked it up from the stack with her usual working attention and felt the cipher variant resolve against her palms. A new form. Something she had not encountered in 4 years of handling enemy material. Not an evolution of an existing variant. A genuinely new system. Constructed differently from anything in the enemy's previous cipher history, with a structural logic she had not seen before. It yielded to her touch anyway. Everything did. She read the decoded content with the focused stillness of someone receiving significant information. Then she set it down and sat for a moment before reaching for her transcription pen. The communique was an operational order. Targeted. Specific. Addressed to an internal contact in the kingdom's intelligence apparatus. With instructions regarding a priority asset identified by operational designation and physical description and current location within the core building. The priority asset was her. The order said, ensure the cipher reader's decoded records are destroyed before the scheduled Crown presentation. The Crown session is the operational window. Confirm receipt by standard channel within 24 hours. She wrote out the transcription with the careful, systematic hand she used for everything. She noted the cipher variant, the timestamp, the instruction sequence. She noted the reference to the Crown presentation, the formal session scheduled for the following week at which she was to present the full intelligence picture to the assembled court. She noted that someone in this building had known about the Crown session timeline and had communicated it to the enemy in enough time for this order to be composed and transmitted and intercepted. She took the transcription to Vorn's office and set it on the desk. She said, "The new communique names me." Vorn read the transcription twice. The first time with the rapid focus of a professional absorbing urgent operational information. The second time more slowly, with the expression of someone confirming that what they read the first time was actually what it said. Then she looked up at Maren, and the quality of her attention shifted from the operational to the personal in the specific way of a senior officer understanding that the situation had just become something different from a standard internal security matter. She said, "How long ago was this transmitted?" The timestamp puts it at 36 hours before interception. Maren sat down in the chair across from Vorn's desk without being invited, because the situation had moved past the formalities, which means the communication went out before the access log was implemented, before the security tightening. Vorn was already reaching for her communication device. The movement she made with it was not a standard channel transmission. It went through the restricted parallel system, which told Maren that wherever this message was going, it was not going through any channel the informant could monitor. Dorian arrived at the intelligence building within 20 minutes. He came directly to Vorn's office, and Maren watched him read the transcription with the focused compression of a man processing significant information quickly, not because he was rushing, but because rapid, accurate comprehension was simply how his mind worked, she had learned. When he finished, he set the page down and looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely past the professional register. He said, "You were going to tell me this in the morning briefing." She had been, yes, through the correct channel, at the correct time, with the correct professional distance. The morning briefing would have been the appropriate moment. He said, "I am glad Vorn reached me tonight instead." The secure residence was a set of rooms on the core building's upper floor, used occasionally for visiting intelligence assets whose safety required proximity to the building's security infrastructure. Maren was moved there before the evening was out, with her working materials and the locked correspondence box, and the specific internal adjustment of someone who had been managing their own safety alone for a long time, and was now being asked to allow other people to manage it with them. She managed the adjustment. It was not comfortable, and she did not pretend it was comfortable, and she did not say anything about it that was not accurate. Dorian came to the secure residence that evening. Not with Vorn, not as part of any official security briefing, alone, which was itself unusual enough that the monitoring detail at the corridor entrance had checked his authorization twice before standing aside. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at him for a moment, and then stepped back to let him in. Because his presence there was not a surprise to the part of her that had been tracking the shape of things between them with the accuracy she brought to everything. He stood in the center of the room and looked at her with the directness he had been developing. Across the past 3 days of proximity, the directness of a person who had decided that managing the distance between them with procedural courtesy was no longer an honest response to what the distance actually was. He said, "I brought you here." He said it with the specific weight of a person naming their own responsibility accurately. "The danger you are currently in is a direct consequence of your presence in this building, which is a direct consequence of my decision to accept Vorn's proposal to bring you in." He held her gaze. "I am not going to manage that from a distance." She looked at him for a long moment. The honest part of her, the part that had always been more reliable than the cautious part, recognized that his presence in this room was not a professional decision and was not being performed as one, and that receiving it as only a professional decision would be its own form of inaccuracy. She said quietly, "Why did you come yourself?" Not why did you come, she knew why he had come. Why himself, without the buffer of official process? His answer was simple and unguarded in the way that true things are simple when a person has stopped managing them. "Because you are in danger in a building that is supposed to protect you, and I wanted you to know that I understand what that costs and that I am not abstracting it into a security protocol." They sat across from each other in the secure residence for an hour, working through the operational implications of the named communique, the Crown session timeline, the informant's access level, the narrowing field of possible identities. The work was real and necessary, and it also provided both of them with the structure that proximity without structure would not have afforded. Near the end of the hour, Maren picked up the new communique again. She had been aware of a secondary layer in it since the first reading, a quality of encoding. Beneath the primary message that she had noted and set aside in the urgency of the operational content. She held it now with her full attention and felt the secondary layer resolve against her palms with the same immediacy as everything else. She was quiet for a long moment after it decoded. The secondary layer identified the internal contact by a code designation. For characters, 2 numeric and 2 alphabetic, arranged in a sequence that was internally logical in a way that suggested it was derived from something real rather than randomly assigned. She read the designation aloud. Vorn, who had arrived at the residence door precisely as Maren spoke the 4 characters, stopped in the doorway. Her expression underwent a rapid, controlled reorganization that was itself more informative than anything she said. She recognized it. She recognized it immediately. The code designation decoded to Cor Aldith. Vorn's investigation, given the designation as its focal point, produced corroborating evidence with a speed that reflected both the quality of the preparation she had already done and the fact that, once you knew where to look, the pattern had been there to find for a long time. The financial trail took 4 hours to establish, a series of indirect transfers through 3 intermediary accounts that had been structured with enough sophistication to survive casual review, and not enough to survive the kind of forensic attention Vorn was now applying. The communication record took 2 more hours, cross-referenced against Aldith's access logs and the timing of known enemy operational decisions across the past 2 years. The timeline of intelligence breaches mapped precisely to his access periods. Every significant Cipher intelligence leak, the master Cipher's deployment timeline, the Corps' analytical approach to the Eastern Field variants, the structural details of the Kingdom's border intelligence network had occurred within days of Aldith accessing the relevant records. The pattern was exact, and it was damning, and it had been invisible for 2 years because no one had been looking for it, and he had been careful enough that no one without a reason to look would have found it. Vorn brought the complete file to Dorian at the 4th hour of the morning. Maren was present, she had not slept, which was consistent with how she responded to significant unresolved situations, and Vorn had not suggested she leave, which was consistent with how Vorn had been treating her since the first day. The file was laid on the table between them, and they went through it together in the compressed, focused way of people who understood that the confrontation needed to happen before the morning session, and that the window between now and then was not long. Aldith was brought to the strategy room at the 6th hour. He came with the composed assurance of a man who did not yet know what had been assembled against him, the assurance of someone who had been careful for 2 years and believed that carefulness was sufficient protection. He took the chair across from Dorian with the practiced ease of a senior officer in a familiar institutional setting, and he looked at the file on the table with a brief, professional attention that did not change his expression. Then Vorn opened it. She walked him through it in the direct, systematic way she did everything: the financial trail, the communication record, the timeline of breaches. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The evidence spoke with the clean, inarguable authority of a pattern that had been fully documented and whose documentation left no interpretive space. His composure dissolved in stages, the careful constructed assurance dismantling itself piece by piece as the full scope of what was on the table became clear. He looked at the financial records, and he looked at the communication logs, and he looked at Dorian. And he made the calculations of a man who had run out of good options and was now identifying the least bad one. His gaze moved to Maren. It settled on her with the flat, assessing quality of someone who had decided that the least bad option involved making one final move before the situation became entirely unmanageable. He said, with the controlled precision of a man deploying a prepared position, that he had cooperated with the enemy because he had understood, from his 15 years in the Corps, that the Kingdom's intelligence architecture was structurally compromised by its systematic exclusion of the most capable practitioners, that selling information to the enemy was a rational response to serving an institution that consistently chose designation over competence. The argument was not entirely without logic. That was the uncomfortable thing about it. It had the shape of a principled position, and in a different mouth. offered by a person who had not spent 2 years facilitating border strikes that killed 64 people. It might have been received as something worth engaging with. Dorian looked at him for a long moment. The silence had the particular quality of a powerful person deciding not to respond with the first thing they thought of. Because the first thing they thought of was not the most accurate thing. He said quietly, "That is exactly the assessment that has been costing this kingdom for years. Not your actions, the underlying condition you are describing. The exclusion. The systematic preference for designation over competence." He held Aldith's gaze with the steady focus of someone making a distinction that mattered. "The difference between you and the person sitting across this table from you is that she responded to that condition by documenting what she could do and submitting it through the proper channels and waiting. You responded by facilitating the deaths of 64 people on a border you have never visited." Aldith had nothing to say to this. The argument he had prepared required an opponent who would defend the institution reflexively, and Dorian had not defended it. He was escorted out by the security detail. At the door, with the specific timing of a man who had decided that if he was going to burn everything he would burn it completely, he turned back and delivered what he had been holding in reserve. The new Cipher layer deployed 3 days ago was not a standard evolution. It had been specifically engineered, on his intelligence, to defeat a single reader working alone. And it contained a timestamp, a self-destruct encoding that would render the layer permanently unreadable after a specific date. Maren had 6 days. 6 days was not enough time. It was also exactly the time available, which made the question of whether it was enough time irrelevant. The only productive question was what could be accomplished within it. Maren sat with this for approximately 10 minutes on the morning after Aldith's arrest. In the secure residence with the new communique on the desk in front of her and the timestamp's implication fully absorbed. And then she stood up and went to her working materials and began making a list. She had been quietly cataloging candidates since her second day in the Capitol building. Not because she had anticipated needing them this quickly, she had been thinking further ahead than 6 days. Building toward the training program she intended to propose as part of the institutional reforms, identifying the people who would anchor it. But the candidates existed and the documentation existed, and the 6-day window simply meant she was moving from a future plan to a present urgency, which was a compression she could manage. The Corps' official records contained anomalies that the institution had been attributing to clerical error for years. Encoded documents processed faster than the analytical timeline should have permitted. Cipher variants identified correctly by handlers who had no formal training in that variant structure. Decoded content appearing in preliminary handling notes that should have contained only physical descriptions of the intercepted material. The anomalies were distributed across 4 administrative districts in the capital, produced by 6 individuals whose personnel files listed them as general correspondence handlers, administrative processors, or document management staff, designations so unremarkable that their anomalous outputs had been absorbed into the institutional record as inexplicable and had not been investigated further. She went to them in person. Vorn's authorization cleared her access, and the secure transport detail moved her between locations. With the efficiency of an institution that had reorganized its protective priorities around the 6-day window. The first candidate was a woman named Essa, who worked in the Eastern District Correspondence Office and who had been producing anomalous cipher handling results for 3 years. Maren sat across from her in the small staff room of the Correspondence Office and placed a sealed document on the table between them and watched Essa's hands when she picked it up. The recognition was immediate and mutual, the slight stilling of the hands. The interior quality of attention that settled over a person's face when their gift was engaged without their conscious direction. Essa looked up from the document and found Maren looking at her with the expression of someone who knew exactly what she had just seen. There was a long moment of the specific silence that exists between 2 people who have been carrying the same secret in different rooms for years and are now in the same room. Maren said simply, "I know what that feels like." The second candidate confirmed within the hour. The third, a young man named Reeve who processed diplomatic correspondence in the central administrative building, needed 20 minutes of careful conversation before he was willing to demonstrate, and then demonstrated with a completeness that made Maren revise her output estimate upward. The fourth candidate's gift, when tested, proved to be a variant she had not anticipated, not cipher reading exactly, but a related capacity for encoded pattern recognition that was compatible with the distributed decryption method she was developing. For readers, 3 confirmed cipher touch variants and 1 pattern recognition variant that she integrated into the framework with the systematic adaptability of someone building a tool from available materials rather than ideal ones. The training took 4 days. She worked them hard and she worked them honestly, which meant telling them exactly what she knew and exactly what she did not know and exactly what the 6-day window required and what it would cost. She taught them the distributed method, the way multiple readers' gift outputs could converge on a single document to produce a combined decryption that exceeded what any individual reader could achieve alone. She taught them to trust their gift's output without the instinct to second-guess it, which was the hardest thing to teach because it required dismantling years of learned self-doubt in 4 days. Dorian observed the 3rd training session. He came without announcement, took a position near the studio door, and remained there for 2 hours without speaking. At the end of the session, when the 4 readers had successfully completed their first joint decryption of a test document, a historical cipher variant that Maren had selected for its complexity, he remained in the doorway while the others filed out. She was gathering the session materials when he said, "How did you know they were there?" Without turning around, because the answer was already forming in the clear, direct language she had been using with him for days. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is reading something they are not supposed to be able to read, and is pretending they are not." She set the last document in its folder and looked at him then. "I know because I did it for 4 years. He held her gaze with the quiet, complete attention that had become the most consistent thing about him in her presence. On the 5th day, the 4 readers attempted a full joint decryption of the new cipher layer. The method worked. The layer opened. The decoded content began to emerge in the converged output of 4 gifts working in sustained contact with the same document. And then Maren felt the final internal lock. It was in the document's deepest layer, a terminal seal that the distributed decryption method had brought to the surface but could not resolve, because it required not just multiple readers, but a reader of her specific gift strength at the precise convergence point. A central anchor. Her. If she burned out during the final lock, the entire decryption failed. The layer would seal permanently. The 6 days would have produced nothing. She set the document down carefully and looked at her hands for a moment. She did not tell the others. The Intelligence Corps' main chamber had been prepared for dual purpose, the decryption session at one end of the long central table. The Crown session convened simultaneously at the other, so that the decoded content could be entered into the official record in the same breath as its production. This was Vorn's arrangement, and it had the specific elegance of a person who understood that the timing mattered as much as the content, that a decoded document entered into the Crown record in the moment of its decryption was a document that could not be quietly absorbed into a restricted archive. The assembled court filled the chamber's gallery, 43 people, including the senior counsel, the territorial representatives who had extended their capital visits at Dorian's specific request, and the full Intelligence Corps staff, even the junior officers, even the administrative handlers, even the correspondence processors from the 4 districts who had never previously been summoned to a Crown session, and who stood along the gallery's east wall with the slightly stunned attentiveness of people who understood they were witnessing something outside the normal boundaries of their institutional experience. Maren stood at the decryption end of the table and felt the room with the comprehensive attention she brought to every significant space, the weight of the assembled court pressing against the chamber's acoustics, the specific quality of the morning light through the high windows, and beneath all of it the steady, unhurried awareness of what she was about to do and what it might cost. Essa stood at the document's upper left corner, Reeve at the lower left, the 3rd reader, a quiet woman named Dov, at the upper right, the pattern recognition reader, a young man named Kale, at the lower right. For positions, for gifts, the distributed decryption framework arranged around the new cipher layers document with the careful geometry of a method that had been tested for 1 day and was now being asked to perform under full institutional witness. Maren placed her palms flat on the document's center. The room went entirely silent. She felt S's gift engage at the upper left corner, a distinct quality, different from her own. The specific texture of another person's cipher touch registering against the document's encoding from a different angle. Reeves followed, and then Dobbs. And then Cale's pattern recognition working the structural framework beneath the cipher variants. And the convergence of 4 gifts on a single document produced something she had not fully anticipated, not just combined output, but a resonance. The 4 readings reinforcing each other in a way that made the cipher's resistance dissolve faster and more completely than even the 5th-day test had suggested. The outer layers opened in the first 4 minutes. The intermediate layers took 12 more, the documents nested encoding yielding in sequence as the distributed decryption moved inward from the edges. The 4 readers holding their positions with the focused steadiness of people who had been trained for 4 days and were now discovering that the training had been sufficient. She could feel them through the document, their gift outputs like 4 distinct voices contributing to a single sustained note, each one necessary, none of them alone enough. And then the outer work was done, and the final internal lock was there. She had known it would feel like this. She had felt it on the 5th day, and she had known then, and she knew now. The terminal seal's resistance was not like the cipher layers. It was not a system to be read. It was a barrier specifically engineered to resist reading, to push back against gift touch with the specific counterpressure of something designed by people who understood, at least partially, what they were trying to defeat. She pushed through it. She gave the final lock everything she had, not the controlled, measured output of the training sessions, but the full unmanaged depth of a gift that had been operating at partial capacity for 4 years in a cottage in Edrin and was now, in this room, in front of this court, finally being asked to show its complete range. She felt the depletion arrive, and she kept going. She felt the barrier's resistance, and she kept going. She felt the specific quality of a capacity approaching its limit, and she kept going. Because the document was almost open, and the 64 dead on the border had names, and the next 64 had not yet been given them. The terminal lock released. The decoded content arrived in full, complete, plain, unambiguous. The enemy's operational plan for the next 12 months. 3 border vulnerabilities of immediate strategic significance. And at the document's deepest layer, a secondary content she had not anticipated. The full communication record between the enemy's cipher division and their internal kingdom contact. Spanning 2 years, naming every piece of intelligence that had been sold, and when and for how much. Cor Aldith's name appeared 14 times. One other name appeared twice. A name that was not Aldith's. A name that belonged to a person currently sitting in the gallery. She straightened. The chamber was very quiet. She was aware of Essa and Reeve and Dov and Cale lifting their hands from the document's corners. The resonance of the joint session dissolving back into individual silence. Vorn was already moving toward the gallery with the quiet urgency of someone who had received significant information and was acting on it before the room had time to react. Lord Fenwick, a senior court official who had been present at the assembly reading 4 months ago and who had laughed with the rest of the room, rose from his council seat. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a man delivering a political statement, but the voice of a man doing something he understood was necessary and perhaps overdue. For the record, he said, I would like to formally acknowledge that the intelligence presented today was produced by a woman whose application to this corps was read aloud as entertainment 4 months ago in this building. The gallery absorbed this. Dorian rose from his seat at the crown end of the table. Every eye in the chamber moved to him. Dorian did not immediately speak. He looked at Maren across the length of the chamber table with the expression she had come to know. As his most honest one, the expression that had moved past the managed neutrality of a king in an official setting and arrived at the face of a person who had something true to say and was deciding how to say it correctly. Then he did something that produced a brief, audible adjustment in the gallery's collective attention. He said, I would like her to address the court first. The procedural unusualness of it was understood by everyone in the room. A king deferring the floor to a non-council member at a crown session was not standard form. It was not accidental. It was a deliberate reordering of the room's hierarchy, performed publicly and in front of the full institutional record. And every person in the gallery understood exactly what kind of statement that reordering was making before Maren had said a single word. She stood at the center of the chamber. The morning light from the high windows fell across the table in long, even bars. And the decoded document was still open in front of her. And the 43 people in the gallery were looking at her with the full, undivided attention of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary and were now being invited to understand it. She had not prepared a speech. The decision not to prepare had been deliberate. She had made it the previous evening when the temptation to prepare had been strong, and she had recognized the temptation as a form of protection, a way of managing how much of herself she spent in this room. And she had decided that managed self-expenditure was not what this moment required. She said, "I want to tell you what I have done. Not what I am capable of, what I have specifically done. In the 4 years before I arrived in this building, and what it cost, and what it produced, and what the distance between those two things means." Her voice was even. She had always been someone whose steadiness increased rather than decreased under pressure. Her gift operated the same way, its accuracy sharpening in the presence of complexity rather than degrading, and she brought that steadiness to the chamber now, not as performance but as the natural quality of a person who was finally in the correct room saying the correct things. She described the application, not its content. The court had access to the content through the official record, but its preparation. The 2 years of documentation, the systematic testing of her gift's parameters, the careful choice of formal intelligence language because she had understood that the correct register was necessary precisely because the gift would not be granted the benefit of the doubt. She described the sample decryption she had included and the reasoning behind its selection. A section of the enemy's strategic cipher that she had chosen because it was complex enough to demonstrate the gift's full capability and specific enough to be independently verifiable. She said, "I submitted that application because the proper channel existed, and I believed that the proper channel deserved to be used." She paused. "I understood it might fail. I had prepared for failure. What I had not prepared for was being read aloud." The gallery was very still. She described receiving the account of the assembly. Not with the language of grievance. She was not here to perform injury, but with the specific, accurate language of a person describing an event that had consequences worth documenting. She named the sentence the king had laughed at. She named it precisely from memory, because her memory did not spare her the precision of things she had decided to carry. Then she described the locked correspondence box. She described the decision to hold the decoded master cipher rather than submit it. She did not soften this or apologize for it or frame it as anything other than what it was, a deliberate choice, made by a person who had been told by royal laughter that her gift was a joke, to withhold that gift until the institution demonstrated some capacity to receive it as something other than entertainment. She said, "I want to be precise about what that decision cost. Not what it cost me, what it cost the kingdom." She held the gallery's attention with the level gaze of someone who had thought about this question for 4 months and had arrived at an honest answer. "I do not know whether the intelligence I held would have prevented the border strikes. I do not know whether it would have been acted on in time, even if submitted. What I know is that the question was never asked, because the gift that produced the intelligence had been designated a joke. And a gift designated a joke has no institutional channel through which to insist that it is not." She said, 64 people died on the border. I am not assigning those deaths to the assembly or to the laughter. I am assigning them to the condition that made the laughter possible, the institutional assumption that the form of a person tells you the content of their capability before you have examined either. A long silence followed. Not the silence of a room with nothing to respond, the silence of a room with too much sorting through it. Then 3 court officials rose simultaneously from different points in the gallery. Not coordinated, spontaneous. The independent decisions of people who had heard something they recognized as requiring a response and had made the same decision about what the response was. Lord Brennan of the Northern Territory, Lady Sorve of the Eastern Council, Administrator Hale, who had processed Maren's original application transfer and who had not laughed at the assembly but had not spoken when the laughter happened either, and who was, by the quality of his rising, settling a 4-month account with himself as much as with the room. All 3 said the same thing, in their own words, with their own weight. They declared for the record. The gallery watched three powerful people stand for a woman who had saved the kingdom from a chair in a cottage in Edron. And the room understood, with the quiet completeness of a truth arriving at its correct destination, that the time for the other kind of response had passed. He had prepared the reform proposals with Vorn over the previous week, the institutional framework, the formal language, the procedural architecture of changes that needed to be specific enough to be implemented and comprehensive enough to be meaningful. The preparation had been thorough, and he was glad of it, because the prepared portion of what he was about to say was going to require less of him than the unprepared portion. And he wanted the prepared portion to carry its own weight, so that when he arrived at the unprepared portion, he could give it his full attention. He stood at the crown end of the table and addressed the full chamber. The formal acknowledgement came first. He named the assembly incident by date and by the specific nature of what had occurred, not the diplomatic summary of an institutional review, but the accurate description of an event he had participated in and was now entering into the official court record under his own seal. The date, the application, the public reading, his laughter. He named his laughter specifically because the record deserved the specificity, and because a man who names his own worst moments accurately is a man who has actually reckoned with them rather than managing the appearance of reckoning. The gallery received this with the attentive silence of people understanding that a king was doing something kings rarely did in formal session, not performing accountability but enacting it, in the specific form of accurate self-documentation in an unrevocable record. Then the proposals. The gift-based intelligence recognition protocol, a formal assessment and intake framework for applicants with documented supernatural gifts, including and specifically Omega designates, with a standardized evaluation process built around the gift's demonstrated capability rather than the applicant's prior credentials or designation status. The protocol would include an independent review board with permanent Omega representation, so that the assessment of gifts like Maren's would never again be subject exclusively to the judgment of people who had no framework for understanding what they were evaluating. 3 permanent Omega seats on the Intelligence Corps Advisory Council, not courtesy positions, not consultative roles. Voting seats with full institutional authority over the Corps' operational and personnel decisions. The formal establishment of the Touch Reader Training Program as an official Corps function. Housed in a dedicated studio with proper equipment and proper compensation, and a training framework designed by Maren Vael and implemented under her direct authority as the program's founding director. The formal entry into the official intelligence archive of the 47 decoded communiques produced in Edron between 4 years ago and the date of Maren's arrival at the capital, listed under her name as their author with their production dates, so that the record showed clearly and permanently what 4 years of unsupported gift work had produced, and when it had been available, and when it had been accessed. And the gap between those 2 dates was visible in the official record for as long as the record existed. And finally, a formal statement entered under the Crown seal, acknowledging that the kingdom's intelligence capacity had been materially compromised by the institutional practices that the above protocols were designed to correct, and that the correction was not a reform but a debt repayment, and that the distinction between those 2 things mattered. He set the last document down. The chamber was quiet with the specific quality of a room that has received something significant and is holding it carefully before responding. Then he stepped away from the crown table. This was the moment that the official record would describe, in the careful neutral language of court documentation, as a departure from standard formal address protocol. He crossed the chamber floor, the full length of it, past the decoded document still open on the table, past the positions where Essa and Reeve and Dav and Kale had stood that morning, and he stopped in front of Maren with the directness of a man who had decided that what needed to be said between them deserved to be said in front of the full court and the full record, not because he wanted an audience, but because she deserved a witness. He looked at her. The unguarded expression, the one she had been watching move closer to the surface across 10 days of proximity, was fully present now. Not managed, not contained, simply there on his face in the plain. Honest form of something that had stopped waiting for the correct procedural moment. He said, "I laughed at something I had not read." He said it quietly, and the chamber's acoustics carried it to every person in the gallery. "And I have read it now. Everything. The application, the sample decryption, the private record book, the 47 communiques, the decoded master cipher. I have read all of it. He held her gaze with the steady, complete attention she had come to understand was his most honest form of presence. And I want the record to show that I was wrong in the most specific and complete way a person in my position can be wrong, not through cruelty, but through the assumption that the thing I had not read was not worth reading. That the form of the person who submitted it told me something definitive about the content before I had opened the first page. A breath. The chamber held it with him. The rest of my reign, he said, is the appropriate response to that. Not an apology, an architecture. The structures we build from this day forward are the form that accountability takes when it is serious rather than performed. His voice was quieter still. Will you stay? Not because the kingdom needs your gift, though it does. Not because the protocol requires a founding director, though it does. Because I need you to know that you are seen. Fully, accurately. Without the assumption of diminishment that you have been navigating for 4 years. He paused. I need you to know that I see you. And I would like the chance to keep doing that for a very long time. The chamber held its breath. Maren looked at him. She looked at him with the comprehensive, unhurried attention she brought to everything she took seriously. Reading him the way she read everything, not just the surface but the full depth of what was there. The encoding and the plain language simultaneously. What she found was not the man who had laughed at a sentence in an assembly room. What she found was a man who had spent 10 days systematically dismantling his own certainties and had not stopped at the comfortable depth. She said, I will stay. The gallery exhaled. And then, with the quiet precision that was simply how she was, she said, I have one condition. His expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but carried the warmth of one. He said, name it. The condition, she said, is that the protocol's first formal assessment is not an Omega applicant. It is a review of every application this Corps has rejected in the past 10 years on designation grounds, to determine how many of them contained capabilities we have been operating without. She held his gaze. I want to know how many locked boxes are sitting on shelves in cottages across this kingdom. I want that number in the official record before the protocol processes a single new applicant. The chamber was very still. He said, without hesitation, before the end of this month. 1 year changed the shape of things. Not all at once. Change of the institutional kind did not arrive dramatically. Did not announce itself with a single transformative moment that reorganized everything downstream. It arrived the way Maren's gift arrived, through consistent contact over time. The encoding yielding gradually to sustained attention until the plain language underneath was simply what was there. And the cipher that had obscured it felt, in retrospect, less like a formidable barrier and more like a layer that had always been removable by the right approach. The rejected application review produced its number in 3 weeks, 11 days ahead of the deadline Dorian had set. Because Maren had organized the review team herself and had calibrated the timeline against what she knew about how long it took to read 47 documents carefully when you were looking for something specific. The number was 61. 61 applications rejected on designation grounds in the past 10 years, of which the review identified 19 that contained documented gift capabilities warranting formal reassessment. Of those 19, 14 individuals were located and contacted. 11 agreed to reassessment. 9 were formally inducted into the Corps through the new protocol in the first 6 months. The number 61 was entered into the official record under the Crown Seal, as Maren had required, and it sat there in the permanent archive with the patient, undeniable solidity of a documented fact that could not be quietly revised into a more comfortable form. The touchreader training program opened in the East Wing studio in the 3rd month. The space had been converted from a record storage room. Maren had chosen it for its light and its quiet and its distance from the main analytical chambers. Because she understood that people learning to trust a gift they had been managing in secret needed space that did not feel like an institutional setting until they were ready for it to feel that way. Essa led the first cohort's morning sessions. Reeve developed the Cipher variant familiarization curriculum with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had discovered, at 23, that the thing he had been quietly doing in the correspondence office for 3 years had a name and a framework and people who understood it. Dav and Kale trained the second cohort, while Maren was occupied with the operational work. And the program produced its first independent practitioner, a young Omega woman from the Northern District who had been processing diplomatic correspondence for 2 years and whose anomalous output rate had been attributed to unusually fast reading in the 4th month. Aldous was appointed community liaison in the 5th month, which was Maren's proposal and which Dorian accepted without modification. The role required someone who understood both the village context that produced unrecognized gift-bearers and the institutional context they were being invited into. And there was no one in the kingdom better positioned for that particular bridge than a 60-year-old correspondence clerk from Edrin who had been advocating for Maren Vael for 4 years and had the specific, durable credibility of a person whose support had not been contingent on the outcome. He arrived at the capital with one bag and his half-moon spectacles and the expression of a man who had been doing the correct thing for a long time and was now being given the institutional framework to do it more effectively, which was satisfying in the specific, practical way that Aldous found most things satisfying. He set up his liaison office with the same careful order he had always brought to the correspondence office in Edrin. And on his first day he wrote letters to 7 village correspondence clerks across the kingdom, asking them to tell him about anyone in their community who read things they should not have been able to read. Within 2 months, 4 of the 7 had written back with names. The locked correspondence box from the cottage in Edrin sat on the corner of Maren's desk in her core office, empty. Its contents officially entered into the archive, its lock standing open. She had debated whether to keep it and had decided yes, because it was the most accurate object she owned for the full story of what her gift had cost and what it had eventually made possible, and accuracy mattered to her more than comfort. And the box on the corner of her desk was a daily reminder of both the cost and the possibility without collapsing one into the other. She and Dorian were bonded at the winter solstice in the palace's inner courtyard under the open sky, because she had asked for the sky above her and the ground under her feet, and he had said yes without asking why, which was itself a form of understanding she had come to associate with him at his best. Aldous stood in the front row beside Vorn, who attended in working clothes with the practical absence of ceremony of a woman, for whom the event's significance did not require formal dress to be real. Essa and Reeve and Dav and Kale stood together in the 3rd row, wearing the training program's formal insignia, and Maren saw them there and felt the specific, unhurried fullness of a woman who had built something that was larger than herself and would continue after the moment that produced it. By the following autumn, she was expecting their first child, and the training program had certified 14 practitioners, and the protocol had processed 31 applicants, and the official record contained the number 61 in permanent ink under the crown seal. And the kingdom's intelligence architecture was stronger than it had been in a generation, built in part on the foundation of what a laughed-at application letter had turned out to contain. She sat at her desk on a quiet morning before the building filled with the day's work. With the open correspondence box on her right, and the current intercept queue on her left, and the winter light coming through the window she had eventually been given, a large one, facing east. The best light in the building, and she pressed her palms flat on the desk in the old habit of a person who had always thought most clearly through her hands. She thought about the cottage in Edrin, the shelf where the box had lived for 4 years, the rule about looking at it only once a day, which had been the correct rule for that time and that circumstance, a form of self-protection that had kept her intact through the long period of waiting, that had preserved the gift and the record and the dignity of both until the moment when preservation was no longer the primary task. The primary task now was different. The primary task now was building, and she was good at building. And she had the institutional support and the people and the time and the open sky above her, and the ground was solid under her feet. And every door that had ever been locked to her had eventually yielded. Everything did, in the end, given the right hands and the right amount of time. She picked up the first document from the intercept queue. Her palms warmed against it in the old familiar way, the encoding transparent to her touch. The plain language arriving before she had consciously decided to read it. She read it. She reached for her transcription pen. She began. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.